So maybe here are some questions that you've asked yourself, right? As we've moved on from the election of 2024 to the present day. Where the heck are the Democrats?
Yeah.
What's happening with the dysfunctional American two-party political system? And if we don't support what the Trump administration is doing to our people and, our rule of law, how do we find any hope that we might have left for regaining control of our democracy?
Yeah. And along those lines, what do we even mean when we say Democrat these days? Well, we've asked ourselves the very same questions, and to be honest, we've come up empty. And as a result, we decided to ask these very same questions of a Democratic insider, as this week we get to talk about how to be a better Democrat. You're listening to What Do You Mean by That with your co-hosts Sarah and me, Sasha.
This whole episode today centers around a question that I have been personally asking myself. So I'm really excited that we have a special guest here to answer all of the questions that Sarah and I have. So would you please introduce yourself for our audience?
Yeah, happy to. For those that are listening, my name is Megan Imperial. I am in the Oakland, California area and really excited to be here today. I have a background within local politics as well as statewide. And regionally, there's a lot of work to do. But I think I come to this space mainly wearing my political hat as I've been a part of the California Young Democrats for over 6 years, going to be the incoming women's political boot camp chair at the California Democratic Party level, really for the next 4 years there. And then have a long and strong history and relationships with a lot of our elected leaders throughout the state here in California and some relationships nationally as well. So my main issues I personally care about are women's issues, and I think every issue is a women's issue, but really around transportation, housing policy, and the like. So really excited to be here with you all.
Well, thank you. We're going to dive in, and I think we're going to start sort of at a higher level to begin with, because this is, like I said, I have a lot of questions about how to be a better Democrat myself, and this is one of my sort of main grappling issues right now because there's been a lot of disappointment. I think for those
Mhm.
of us who stand against Trump's extreme Republican MAGA agenda, right? At the lack of visibility and sort of the less than convincing positioning of the Democratic Party, especially coming out of the 2024 election, which, in America's two-party system for now is really the only party that many of us have hope for. So, how do you think, especially since you have such a deep history with the Democratic Party, how do you think about being a member of the Democratic Party right now? And what are its goals really as we move, through 2025?
Yeah, I think, you're spot on with the party system and the simplicity and rather the complexity that comes with an oversimplified party system of just two parties. The Democrats are known as really the big tent party, 50 shades of blue, as you will, as I've heard folks coin it. And I think right now, in particular, to be a Democrat is it's really an opportunity, but it's also a cautionary tale, I think, at the end of the day. We are facing, I think, unprecedented, potentially regime changes happening nationally, authoritarianism. I'm Filipina and Salvadorian myself, and my parents, when they immigrated and left their countries respectively to come seek refuge here in America, they are even saying it feels like this is the start of what that feels like in terms of martial law, in terms of the authoritarianism, rather. And so I think that makes it so the Democrats, as you just mentioned, being one party that you have hopes for, and they have an opportunity really to drive the message, to really be bold, to be impactful, to stand up for our rights and to make those changes. And I think one of the top three issues, number one, is around cost of living. It is too high a cost to just live a normal life. And that includes housing, that includes transportation, both public and private, that includes childcare access. So there's so many different avenues in which cost of living affects that really at the end of the day, that's a big crux that the Democrats should really be focusing on. And I think we're also seeing changes in terms of government trust. Government trust is really not at an all-time high, as I think folks know. There's folks that are wanting to be involved in politics and wanting to seek their change, but it's also a time where there's an anti-establishment message kind of going around. And I think that's the case even within the Democrats. So, you have the Republican Party, and you also have the Democratic Socialists as well. And independents, libertarians, and so on and so forth. But I think everyone has sort of seen and felt this shift where we have kind of for the last 8, 10 years, ever since the current president first ran for office, there has been a rhetoric shift on a global scale and also on a microcosm level. So I think that definitely has affected the Democratic Party. And because I'm in California, and specifically in part of the one area of I think of it as Senate District 7, as I just ran a campaign there, but it is the bluest area in the whole state of California. So there's also a hyper bubble even for Californians that I think folks don't really recognize and realize. And for California Democrats, the issues are, we're fighting right alongside our union brothers and sisters, working class families, folks that are really hitting the front of the issue of hardship right now. But also on the flip side of that, there's still a lot of infighting that's happening. There's a lot of infighting that happens around housing and transit in particular. And I think there's around different parts of the nation, you don't see as many of those fights that happen. I'm currently in Washington, D.C. right now, where there's construction happening all over here. This is not a state, of course. So if it was, maybe we would have been able to inch along for the win this past election cycle. But I think right now, the Democrats, there's so many different things that this administration is throwing at us that we really need to look at. How do we consolidate? How do we focus on our top 3 issues that we really need to be pushing forward and be bold and really, at the end of the day, organize 365 days out of the year? And that's really where we pick up because, and you're talking about how to be a better Democrat, we haven't been as on top of that, in my opinion, as maybe the Republicans have, which is why you've also seen Republicans gain threshold majorities in school board elections, very local elected offices, whereas the Democrats haven't gained as much traction there. And we have seen that shift even in education, Moms for Liberty, those type of groups. So yeah, I think really this is an opportune time, but it also things can go wrong very quickly with where we're at.
I appreciate that. And I think, as you were mentioning, Moms for Liberty and school boards, and I think about the Republicans being really good at the long game, right? Like when it
Yeah.
comes to Dobbs and, and thinking about how they spent 50 years basically, trying to redo that whole abortion fight. And I
Yeah.
think about what you were talking about with the Democrats, and the platform has been that of, these are everyday people. These are, it's a party that's sort of affiliated with the struggle, especially, I think in the last 50 to 70 years,
Mhm.
that has really been sort of a hallmark of the Democrats. Yet I feel like when we think about the 2024 election, the Republicans were so effectively, and I mean Trump and MAGA really, were so effectively able to tap into everyday people's sort of fear and struggle with very simple messaging. And I think the Democrats really missed an opportunity to highlight the party values, right, in a very simple way. And if, cost of living is something that the party really cares about, for example, like how do we effectively shift and message policy and party focus towards this concept of everyday economic dignity and opportunity?
Yeah, I think that, there's been, how do you shift? Well, first of all, yes, this is the party for everyday working class people, but let's start with the elephant in the room as well is there's a lot of folks that think the Democrats are elitists, are coastal elites that are poking their business into other folks and they, maybe been told that we're condescending, they don't talk to people. And I say that as someone who also agrees. There are folks who are in their own circles and bubbles, and they're not recognizing that, everyday folks are really struggling. And I think that that's not just in the Bay Area, that's nationwide. That is in Florida, that's in Idaho, that's in Texas. Everything is extraordinarily high in terms of living. And so when you tap into that fear, it's very easy for the Republicans to tap into fear. Fear is not uplifting, but it's everyone has fear of I going to be able to protect my family? Which is why we've seen a rise in the vitriol against immigrants in our immigrant population that has really provided a lot of essential services in terms of the food industry, in terms of the care and taxes that they pay into our system. But yet, if you take immigration as one example, that fear has been exploited because I don't know my neighbor. I don't talk to my neighbor. And I think that also is the case. I'm not saying Republicans talk to their neighbors, but I think they have used those trends and effectively, like you mentioned, scapegoated the innocent, scapegoated the victim in an attempt to really not point eyes and fingers at the billionaire and the oligarchy system that's at the top of our necks and our throats. And I think for the Democrats in particular, it's really a shift in meeting people where they're at, talking with folks, going into hard areas. And I know there are areas that are purple, and those are areas we need to flip and win. And when you talk about, when I think about what is effective strategy, it's talking to people, not just to win a message, but to see what they really care about. So I'm saying cost of living, but there are so many different issues that affect every single working class person. The middle class is shrinking and shrinking, but we really need to tap into talking to people, gathering the data. And the unfortunate pieces around data in particular is the Republicans and the Koch brothers in particular, they do fund for free. They give data to Republican candidates and they give it pro bono. And that's one of those things that for Democrats running say you're running in a race that's a million people. And I think for PDI, one of the political systems that is widely used in California, you may have also heard of VAN and GP as well. That's another one, NGP VAN. But I mentioned those things as well as because they're also very effective in getting the smaller down ballot candidates the actual data that they need to be effective into the races when they're meeting people where they're at. When you're knocking on someone's door and you're talking to them and you can say, because I have the data, I know what your top three issues are. I know that healthcare is your number one because this is the data I was given, so I can be confident in approaching this store. Whereas that costs a lot of money on the front end for any candidate, and it could run you between 15, 20,000, 40,000, depending on how large the district is. And so if you're running a race and you really care about working class people, and maybe you're in a purple district, but you really don't know how to message effectively because you don't have that data, maybe you're going to just try to message it in, okay, I care about public safety, healthcare, and homelessness. Those are my top three issues. But how do I message that? That's really something that, unfortunately, because the data is not there all the time for those smaller down ballot candidates, it can be very difficult to reach the voter and to convince that voter. And that's where I think Republicans are very strong as well, is because they have that data. They have a connected system that they've built for over multiple decades. And I think that's something that the Democrats, honestly, we really need to be building out our infrastructure on data, on sharing data internally, looking through the fact that we have a lot of goals that we want to accomplish. But what are the things that, when you look at social media, for example, there's so many different information pieces that are coming down into our phones. So how can we as Democrats effectively message and get folks' attention? Let's just focus on the top three things that we've done. Let's focus on these are the values of the party. Even though we are a big tent, this is what we all agree on. This is where our values align. And here's why you should come into the fold. And I also think the Republicans are good at jockeying for folks in the fear sense. When they do that, they're able to also say, you don't need to worry about what's better for you, how to make a better life, because it's these people in particular, they're the problem. These immigrants or, working class people as well, or whatever group, whatever band of individual that they want to put together and just say it's their fault. Now we know that's not the case. We know we need to be doing so much more on on transportation, on housing and childcare and the like, and on healthcare in particular with Medicaid at the chopping block right now. Those are the issues that I think that we're not really seeing Republicans gain as much, I think right now, input from constituents. I think we're seeing a lot of Democrats get a lot of folks calling them. And I think that's also because Democrats are also really insular within their own constituencies. And so it's also organizing from the ground up and being an effective organizer in those purple red areas so that okay, this is not the first time I'm seeing this information. It takes 7 times for anyone to really hone in and understand and appreciate a piece of information. Remember someone's name, for example. That's why if you're a high propensity voter, which that just means that you vote every single election, including primaries and generals, you are an active voter. That's not very high in natural for American civic engagement, which is really unfortunate. And I think it also ties back to education, which the Republicans have been very effective in dismantling. And it goes back to winning and data and the local boards that they've been very effective in taking over in a lot of ways. So I think there needs to be a lot more support on the local level for smaller candidates. And there needs to be a ground up incentive and data sharing, and then visioning for what we can have together. And I think one of the main things is folks need to see it to believe it sometimes. And I think if you show them that this is possible because it's been done in other areas and other nations, then that is the first step, I think, for getting folks towards the finish line and hopefully, voting Democrat. But it is a tough time right now. And I think there's a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of misinformation. And in terms of how do you vet those things when Facebook has said they're no longer going to fact check, so now we can just make up complete misinformation points and there's not going to be any fees or fines, or even if there are those fees and fines, we know that the oligarchy and the billionaire class, they will pay for those fees and fines and they will disregard laws. And that's exactly what the Republicans are also hoping for, that folks will not be upset enough to really be active and engaged. And so that's the piece that, in terms of, I know your question was around communications, messaging, but I really also see it around how do we engage folks? How do we turn folks from being apathetic, overworked, they have so much on their plate, to now this is serious. Your lives are in jeopardy. Medicaid is on the line. 1 in 3 children in California are on Medicaid, for example. This is a family issue. And framing it that way, there are ways that we can frame it so that more folks can be brought into the fold. But that's something that I think is still being quite frankly looked into. It's only we're in May, so it's only been 6 months since the election, and a lot has happened. And President Trump has given, I think, more executive orders. There was like a point I was looking at in these past few months than any president in the same time frame. I think it's like over 200 or something he's reached at this point. And there are just different levels. I think that different candidates need to also be aware of that they're going to be judged differently based on their ethnicity, their gender. And so I think the main messaging point for also those lower down ballot candidates that we're looking at is focus on the issues, focus on what people really care about. Because yeah, it's great that I'm a woman. It's great that I'm, Asian and Latina, all those things. Yes, let's celebrate. But when so many people are hurting, honestly, there's a lot of folks that they don't care how you identify. They don't care about any of that stuff. They want to know, how are you going to effectively fight for me? And do I trust you? So having trusted voices, trusted partners in the community directly tying to that messaging will be really effective for the Democrats nationwide. But in California in particular, I know that there is a strong, resolute understanding that we need to move forward with organizing 365 days out of the year, which again is paramount to winning elections.
Absolutely. You made so many good points about what the Republicans have done better. And
Mhm.
and hopefully there is been a lot of learning from that. And I think part of it, when you said something like, oh, they don't care about our identities, I get that. And I think one of the things they also did really well was this idea of storytelling through social media, the trad wives, like the extension
Mhm.
pieces of the vision they were selling was so brilliantly
Yeah.
subversive that people didn't totally catch on to what was really going on. And I wonder how Democrats are going to be able to use that storytelling capacity so it's not just straight intellect, like so that we get away from this idea of elitism and saying, I know Medicaid matters to you. Like, yes, it does. And how do we display that in a way that people relate to so that they buy into the messaging in a different way? The thing that you said that I wanted to ask a little bit more about, though, because I think it made a lot of sense, was we need to have it not just be this top down. And then there's some people who are like, dude, this national politics thing is very overwhelming. I want to just look local. What does grassroots activism look like? What role does it play in being an effective Democrat? Like, and how can I and anyone here listening contribute more meaningfully to local efforts? And then on top of that, I guess my other question is, and how do we communicate with those friends who are just like, nah, this doesn't apply to me? You said there's some people who are like, it's too hard. I'm too busy. I don't care. Like, what is the messaging that will make them care? Can we do that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great question. And I think it ties exactly into the organizing efforts that I alluded to. And so starting from the beginning, grassroots organizing, it can take on so many different shapes and forms. But, if you have limited resources, that can be considered grassroots. Maybe if I'm running a field campaign and I have $100,000, I can siphon off 10,000 and pay for some field staff to help out with limited hours. But if I'm a local candidate, I don't have that money. I need to call on my friends and my family, which is why it's good to know your neighbors. It's good to build community. It's good to be involved. And, you don't have to be involved in only political type work to run for office either. You can be a part of a paintball league or a volleyball club, and anyone connected to you in your life, your teachers, your kindergartner teacher, for example, any one of those can help you along the way to getting elected, especially as a local candidate, hyper local. And especially if you're in an area that is red or purple, it helps not to just run as a Democrat or Republican, but I'm your neighbor. I know you. These are the issues that we care about. And I would say on the grassroots level, it's really being diligent. On all campaigns, you have to do that. You have to be consistent, diligent, really assertive, because you have a limited window to win this fight. And then that's it. You got to see what the numbers are. What's that result going out to be? And so it's really calling on folks, mobilizing people. There are a lot of different apps and resources that candidates can use. There's a lot also that the Democratic National Committee and Young Dems of America, which is an umbrella youth caucus under the national. And before I even answer this grassroots, I think it's important to know, how do the Democrats play nationally and what does that look like? And then, that's the national front. But then California, we have our CDP, the California Democratic Party, and then under that's the California Young Dems as a youth caucus. And I use those two things as an example for the youth in particular, is because young people, getting young folks mobilized, getting them to knock on your doors, reaching out to doing civic engagement and tabling at high schools, at college campuses, at different areas can gain you more volunteers, gain you more recognition. But it's also about building out your base building in terms of not only who I already know, but who do I know that supports me and who do they know? So maybe, Sarah, I know you, I can count on you, and you know me, Sasha. So let's do a house party for me and my candidacy. Let's bring 20 of our neighbors, even 5 of them is great. And what you do from building out house parties is you are able to really, from an intimate setting, have time with a candidate and a smaller level and be able to talk to them, be able to ask policy questions, ask issues that you care about. And that's one of the methods and tools. Now, it's also about fundraising. It costs a lot of money, and that's an opportunity to raise money. But house parties really are not that. It's the focus is to meet your neighbors. The focus is to meet the community. And the fundraising aspect, I mean, in California, it's very expensive to run for office. The last candidate I ran, he raised over $1 million, and that actually over 3 million, I think, closer to that number. And it was over almost 900,000 residents, almost a million residents in that area. So imagine running nationally, right? That's something that, luckily you are able to have something through the Democratic National Committee that's already built in. Hopefully you have the guardrails like the previous one, like Harris did when Joe Biden dropped out. She was able to really fit into her leadership there because it was a transfer because she was VP. So the money could roll over in that committee because they shared that committee. But if you're hyper local, you don't know anybody, you're really on the fringes, but you start to recognize, actually, I do know folks. I know folks in my community. That's how it starts. So I wanted to really emphasize that piece because I think folks think that running for office, you need to know every single thing and, be at the forefront of innovative policy change. And sometimes it's just like, look at some of these people who are holding positions of power and have the audacity to understand that you also know a lot and you also bring plethora of experience. Really, as maybe you might be a mom, you might be working class, you might work in the tech industry or construction, whatever hat that you wear, that's what will attract folks. And then being authentic with who you are, I think is also a part of the grassroots component, and also different campaigns. But in terms of attracting more people and bringing more folks into the fold, that also will, when you are your most authentic self, when you are not faking it as a candidate, people can tell. And it comes across, it radiates off somebody, and everyone is human, even if they're running for office. And so when you're able to bring more folks in to, because they are like, yeah, I really like Megan's message, I would vote for her. But that's not enough. That's where it's like, okay, I need your help. I need you to bring five more people to this field component, but you really got to be talking to every single person that you know, your exes included, ask them for money. You got to also ask everybody for money too. It's one of the ickier things I think folks feel when it comes to political campaigning and grassroots efforts. And, as there's folks that are also very like non-corporate donors, which definitely appreciate in this space, in this time in particular. But running and being at a grassroots level, no matter what, you're going to need funds, even if it's $25, small dollar donations. All those things are super important. And I think where a lot of folks maybe get caught up is they don't want to deal with that. They don't want to deal with the scrutiny that also comes with campaigning. And so we also need to attract folks to be able to run an arena. It's a national organizing training workspace that they basically train folks to run for office. So that's one. Emerge is another that they also train nationally, women, Democratic women in particular. And then there's Ignite National. So they really work with middle school, high school, or elementary to really start paving the path forward to a political opportunity and future. And I think it's important to really envision. I appreciate Ignite National's model in particular because of the fact that it's a mindset shift for especially young girls and young boys, but they work with young girls only. But I think that's where we're also seeing our generational divide, even within the genders that we're seeing. So, within our communities, when we're also talking on a grassroots level of how, I'm maybe this young man over here, he likes Trump. Okay, maybe this young girl over here, and they're in the same community, she liked Kamala, she liked Harris. How can the two of them talk and overlap? Well, maybe they go to the same high school. Maybe they're friends with the same people. Maybe they have more in common than they think. And I think that's the piece for grassroots, especially if you're in a red or purple area, that you're going to also need to be creative, think through, maybe do paint and sip events, maybe have field hockey days. There's also just different, more creative, fun ways to get people involved that are not just the down and gloom of what we see on social media. And there's exciting opportunities. I think that right now, especially, there is exciting opportunities to run really progressive, outstanding young voices who I think folks are craving, but we need those leaders to step up and be willing to honestly also take on the brunt of what it is to run for office on a local level in this time.
But I love that you also, I mean, the fact that you said you have to have the audacity to think that you can do it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that applies even if you're not willing to run for office. I feel like sometimes even the audacity to say, hey, look, this policy is coming up in our state capital. Like, can you please call your reps and sending that to your neighborhood group chat? Like, I think that takes audacity. Any level
Yeah.
of involvement when you're willing to use your voice and share the message with people that you're air quote, like not supposed to talk politics about with, I think it is the next step that we all need to embrace if we want to fight, especially against this massive authoritarian regime that might be coming in. Like if we want to protect democracy, there is a lot at stake now, and we want more people to tap into that audacity. What do you think about like the people who have it and get elected and are now leaders in the Democratic Party, but are not as effective as we want, or we don't even know what's happening? So what do we, I hear tons about calling our representatives, but how else do we hold Democratic leaders accountable for making more noise and being more effective?
Yeah, right now, the Dems, you may hear that there's nothing we can do. We don't have the presidency, we don't have the House, we don't have the Senate, we barely are holding any ground in the Supreme Court as it is. And there are some Democrats who would say, you know what, we just got to figure it out with the Republicans, which, being in DC currently, You do have to work with Republicans, just like when it's Democrats that are in charge, they have to work with Democrats. So that is something that I agree. You just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean you can't work with them. Now, I think that that also plays into how effective a politician can be. And I think though everyone has a place in the political landscape in the system, and when you're talking about how do you hold Democrats in particular accountable, you have to understand who is this Democrat? Who is this politician? What do they care about? Do they care that I'm sending 20 emails? Do they care that I have folks going to their office, talking with them, protesting at their house? Is that going to move them? Or are they someone that they really care about who their donors are? They want their donors to be the ones that are in charge of their policy because maybe they feel beholden in one way or another. There are also those that, yeah, you could give them a bunch of money, but they won't care one way or another. So I think that's the first step, identifying what does this particular person care about? And I think that also part of political and power mapping, as it's widely known as, is just looking at the landscape of, okay, this is what's in front of me, but I think when folks are hoping to hold Democrats accountable right now, I would really urge folks to reach out to Republicans because they're in charge of everything. But I also would say that Democrats don't hold, it's not like we're powerless. We have the constituents, we have the people. And when you're seeing town halls, demand a town hall from your representative. Say, I want to see you in my community. I want you to understand what we're caring about. That goes back to what the Democrats should be doing more effectively is talking with their constituency. If you're in a purple district, if you're in a red area, or your neighbors, you're in a solidly blue area, or your neighbors are red, maybe around the borders, go out into that community, talk to them, make sure that you understand. But I think you really hold Democrats accountable at the end of the day. If there are Democrats that are, what I really appreciate from the DNC perspective, there is some shift happening where they're saying, if you're a Democrat that is not effective, that is not pushing the mold, that is kind of just there, we're going to primary you. We're going to run another young Dem against you. We're going to make this change, and we have to because the Democrats nationally polling not good. Let's just say that in a good light. So there's a lot that we need to be doing, but I think it's also about how do we challenge each other every single day of the year? How do we hold each other accountable right now? There's no election. It's talking to people. There's so many different ways that you can do it, but ultimately going back to who is this person? Who is this individual? What do they care about? And when you're talking about holding folks accountable, sometimes folks get defensive too because they're like, well, I'm doing all this work. I'm putting in it. I'm doing the phone banks. I'm in your community, actually. I've been here, but you just don't know. So why is it my fault? But unfortunately, the constituencies, the residents, they don't care about any of that. If you don't reach them, they're not going to know all the wonderful work you're doing. So you have to be able to spend money on comms, on media, on that marketing piece that which the Republicans have done really well. And unfortunately, we're not the party of billionaire class. We don't have Jeff Bezos funding millions and billions of dollars or Elon Musk. And I mentioned these men's names because, like, at the end of the day, it's not that we're living in normal times of how do you hold a Democrat accountable versus a Republican. How do you hold our democracy accountable? How do we maintain that we are beholden to this Constitution that we have fought so long for, the 14th Amendment? Right now, birthright citizenship is under attack. That would affect me for example, that would affect so many different folks that I know. And these are not normal times. So I also think that my answers are trying to not reflect the normal because unfortunately, this isn't normal what we're dealing with. If it was normal times, I would say, here's the plan. We got to do X, Y, Z, and we got to move. Here's the poll that we've seen, what voters care about. And I think all of those strategies are still very effective. But right now, we are at risk of losing our democracy, and it's a republic if we can keep it, right? This is something that's very, very fragile. And that's why I try to explain all the different components in that way, because I think folks are starting to recognize this is really not normal. I think maybe the three of us were very involved, more plugged in politically, or read the news and the like. And there's a lot of folks that they don't have time to read the news. So they'll maybe be on TikTok. They'll maybe look there. And so that's where I think the Democrats, if we know that however 80-70% of Gen Z is getting their news from TikTok, we got to be on TikTok. We got to reach out there. And then holding ourselves accountable in that way too, of like, we have to win. Let's change things up. Let's change our strategy. I turn to Republicans and just, what are you all doing? How are you all engaging with your constituents? And Republicans in particular have they've been told to stop having those town halls that I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before because it looks bad. It looks bad to have all your constituents yelling at you. It looks bad to be escorting out a little old lady that just asked about how you're going to uplift and uphold our democracy. And again, these are really not normal times that we're living in. And folks need to think, how can I get engaged? Well, let's start with calling. Let's start with calling our representative. Let's see what other organizations are out there right now. There are so many different orgs. And if there's not an organization that's out there, create one. You can create one. You can, if sometimes, unfortunately, you have to build the thing that you're seeking. If no one else is going to build it, you listening right now, you have to do it. You have to build it because that's the only way we're going to get out of this is all of us doing something bit by bit together.
I so appreciate that need to tap into that energy of we all have agency, we all are part of this. And if you want to reap the benefits of a country that, offers all of the public services and safety and everything else that it does, we need to be fighting for it. And I guess my last big question for you is, all this said, the Republican Party still has some divides. Like, if you think there are any moderate Republicans still out there that aren't MAGA, then those are very big divides between, their approach to the rule of law, among other things. But that's not to say that there is total cohesion on the liberal side of things. And I think for a long
Mhm.
time, the Democrats have been this like reactive, we just don't want that. Like that's been the messaging is not that. It would be so much more powerful if you say this like 50 shades of blue for the Democrats, but what efforts do we see in the party right now to come up with a cohesive message of what we're looking for? And what can all of us do to sort of bridge those divides within the Democratic coalition to promote not just like coming up with those goals, but communicating those goals, that vision that I think we're missing right now.
That's a great question. And so there's elections that are happening for party leadership. We just had the elections for the DNC leadership, very, very new folks. And, we're going to have them in California as well. More folks that I'm familiar with on an individual level. But I'd say there's a lot that's being figured out right now. There's a lot that potentially, and again, there's some things that Democrats may not want to share publicly because on a strategic lens, there's things that Republicans are not sharing publicly. So on that front, it is something like you got to maintain that area of here's what I'm going to be able to share with the public. And these are the issues that we care about. We've heard from you. We know what you care about. But maybe my political strategy, I'm not going to share that with everybody yet. Maybe that's not something I'm going to bring everybody even on board with. But the level of cohesion, I mean, there's so many different things that Democrats are aligned on. We're aligned on that we need more housing. We're aligned that the cost of living is too high. We're aligned that these broad-based issues of value in terms of Medicare, we want that to succeed, reproductive health, abortion access. There are a lot of things that we all agree on. And the devil's in the details, though, in terms of where do we go from there in terms of moving things forward. And let's take housing, for example. Within the Democratic Party, I think I was reading at the Public Policy Institute of California. They put out that California has one of the lowest home ownership rates in the country. And we are seeing Californians leaving the state of California. Ezra Klein first mentioned this in his New York Times podcast. And so I definitely recommend folks listening in there where he is able to really look at congressional and national power as it comes to consensus and housing. When you look at California, we're considered progressive. We're considered very progressive. And so why is it that we're not building enough housing, though? Why is it that we have 24% of the nation's homelessness population right here in California? Well, that's because we have a lot of infighting, and the infighting comes into the details of housing. Do we want 100% affordable housing? Well, that costs in California $1 million per unit to make. What about 50% workforce housing? All different types of housing that we really need building on. Even Joe Biden, I will say, and Kamala Harris, when they were running, they were proposing 3 million, respectively, to 2 million homes to build across the nation. In California, we need 3 million homes just to build to keep up with the current demand of homelessness. Why do I mention that as a top issue that we really got to focus and build consensus on? Well, when we're building communities, when we're building neighborhoods, we're also building out families. We're building out neighbors. We're building out generations of friends. We're building out folks who are now going to be playing Little League together because the daughters are in there, right? I think that's how he can really bridge and build is through the policy, is effective policy change, an effective policy change on infrastructure level, on transportation as well. And, Trump is going against all of, he's firing federal employees. That includes national park services. That includes taking away $50 million in Alameda alone for FEMA funding for the sea level rise adaptation. And the reason I bring all this up is because folks don't know what they don't know. And to be able to bridge and build in those communications goals that you're talking about, we have to be able to identify where our weaknesses are. We have to see that we are bleeding ourselves dry here by not solving our own policies. And I think that's the real conversation, a shift that's happening because we cannot afford to lose folks to red states. We cannot afford to have homelessness as well because number one year unhoused for any individual person is 7 years off that person's life. That is unacceptable. So we got to talk to people where they're at. We can't just be in our ivory towers portraying the message of being coastal elites. People have to see us in person, which I think we're seeing those national tours that AOC and Bernie Sanders are doing, which is great, but we need to do more. We need to have a comprehensive strategy. And so that's the piece where I am hopeful that we're going to get there in a couple of months. But in the interim, it's really, I think, needs to be youth led. I think it needs to have that voice and that's unfortunately not, it's easier said than done, right? I think there's a lot of folks in politics. Average age in office can be 60, 70 years old. And when you're looking at that electorate, it's different than the electorate, right? We have folks who have a wide variety of ages, experiences, livelihoods, but maybe don't know how to tap into politics because no one's ever talked to them. No one's ever came to them, spoken to them. That takes resources to communicate our goals. That takes resources to reach out to people, but we must do it. There is no other way we can protect our democracy at this opportune time. If not now, when? This is the moment where we have to be making those strides. So I think that's the best way to push forward on the Democratic Party. Locally here, I would say there's always a Democratic institution in some way, shape, or form connected to you. If you're in Montana and you're like, I'm the only Democrat here, where do I go? There are resources online that will connect you with folks. And I would also say that anyone who wants to be involved and take on leadership positions, in order to be effective and communicate at every level, we need effective leaders. We need folks who are going to answer the calls. We need folks who are going to reach out to folks, who are going to show up. I'm not saying that Republicans or Democrats are doing a worse off job one way or the other. But I think that those are the type of leaders that we need at the helm. And, a great example of this is Congressmember Latifah Simon that we have here locally in the Bay Area in the California 12. She is very passionate and prominent. At the same time, she's looking at what working class folks are really being hit hardest with, and she's fighting for those things. And she's fighting for them on the oversight committee right now. And there's a lot of levers that we can pull simultaneously. But I think the Democrats, because we're so big and we have so many different ideas, again, it's looking at those three issues. And for me personally, that has to do with housing, transportation, and healthcare right now. And I mean, you can swap any of those with education. You can swap it with, you could go up to top five, but I think that's where the issues kind of can get harder and harder to really be effective at if you're trying to do too much all at once. And I think in terms of Democrats, it's really how do we get this one message across to the whole nation? It's through the marketing strategies, through connecting with folks, and then uplifting our young leaders. I'll just close with this. I was at a forum where there was, talking about leadership and in the community. The Hakeem Jeffries was there. And there was no one under the age of 36 who was able to speak. Not able to, but I would say, there was a shout out to the youth in the room, which is great. But I want to see more of the actual young leaders and youth taking the mantle, leading and having hard questions to our leaders. And I think those are the things that if we can have the youth really lead, that's where we can really see that change happen. Because when I talk to other youth, young leaders, high schoolers, they're like, well, they're all old. Why would I get involved? Right? Like, that's not something I really care about. It doesn't seem fun. Doesn't seem like I should be engaged because will I be effective? But that's the other piece that I want to make sure that folks really understand is, when it comes to looking at the way that we govern, the way that we build, the way that we're base building now, we have to have young leaders at the forefront.
I'm totally here for that. I think that's awesome. Well, if people want to find you or learn more about the Democratic Party, how do they get involved? Like, where do they find you?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm on Instagram, very millennial of me, Megan Moves _Imperial. Also, I would say that the work that I'm doing with the California Democratic Party Women's Caucus, you can find me through there. I'm an advisor to the California Young Dems Women's Caucus as well. So there's so many different methods that way. But if folks want to chat or discuss, I'm happy to do that. I think there's a lot to learn, a lot of opportunity to be connected with folks. But yeah, I think that I'm really happy to have been invited on this forum and be able to chat a little bit about what I think would make in terms of better Democrat and how to find me. But I would definitely engage with the Democratic resources that are available and reach out to folks that if I'm not in your area, reaching out to others and seeing how you can plug in and get connected. That would be my call to action to anyone listening is if you've taken this message and you're wanting to get involved, it's that way. It's just reaching out, calling folks and saying, hey, how can I do this? And also say I have my own podcast as well that will be coming out. It's called the Placemakers Academy, where we talk about issues around how do you make place? How do people build? How do we make things happen? And building communities where we want to live, where we want to thrive. And that's another area that you can find me at.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you took to hang out with us and talk about all this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. And if I can ever be a resource to anyone else, please just let me know.
You've been listening to What Do You Mean by That? A show dedicated to being better humans and getting loud for all of us. Hat tip to Sarah's daughter for the logo, and huge thanks to Misasha's son for our incredible theme music. Find out more and subscribe to our newsletter at whatdoyoumeanbythat.com. Because as always, it's all of us or it's none of us.